I'm Nathan Mech, manager of the Acton Institute's Collins Center for Abrahamic Heritage. Welcome to one of the timeliest sessions at Acton University 2025. We're here to discuss free speech on college campuses, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim perspectives. Over the last couple years, we've seen anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim incidents on campuses multiply. We've seen controversial protests and encampments ignite debates around free speech and civil disobedience. We've seen Jewish students barred from campuses. We've seen international students detained or have their visas revoked. And in America, 27% of faculty report feeling unable to speak freely for fear of punishment. I'm happy to announce that in 1 hour, this panel will solve all of those problems. No, we're seeing problems that are not so easily solved, especially in the time we have today. But what we're not seeing is nearly enough civil dialogue between members of the Abrahamic faiths on these crises. And what better place is there than Acton University for just that? So I'm honored to be joined by some esteemed panelists. Dranikoff is chair of Hillel International, which is the largest Jewish campus organization in the world. He is also the founder of the OP Academy, a private equity-focused professional development company. Next to him is Dr. Anthony Bradley, distinguished research fellow at the Acton Institute and research professor of interdisciplinary and theological studies at Kuiper College. He's also the author of over a dozen books. And then finally is Lord Syed Kamall, who is a professor of international relations and politics at St. Mary's University, Twickenham. He's also a member of the UK House of Lords, where he's a shadow minister for health and social care and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for the Commonwealth. Please read our speakers' full bios on the AU app. Finally, if we have time for audience questions, we will do that using the QR code on this screen. You may begin submitting your questions as soon as you have them ready. So, at the Acton Institute, we make a moral case for liberty. Drawing from your faith, your professional experience, and your moral philosophy, why is free speech important? Lee.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. First, thank you for having me. I have done lots of things over the last year and a half. I have not done anything like this. It's really a testament to the organization that you could pull something like this off, and I really appreciate that. We're going to talk a lot about, what do we really mean by free speech and what does it mean on college campuses? But you started with a moral question, a religious question. So I want to start with just a thought. So if a rabbi said to you, I want you to come learn with me, does that conjure anything? For most people, if there are Jews in the audience, you know what that means. It actually has a very specific meaning. It does not mean the rabbi is going to stand up here and talk to you, and you're going to sit in the audience. When a rabbi asks you, do you want to learn with me? What he's actually asking you is, do you want to debate what the meaning of a Jewish text is? So in a way, and in some cases, it's going to feel like an argument. In a way, the concept of learning and debate are two sides of the same coin for Jews and for me. So these sessions, sometimes from the outside, might start to look like arguments. And there was a question that was asked, is this good? Like, is it good that people are sitting around yelling at each other back and forth? And the answer that came back was, these are good if they are, and this is translated from the Hebrew, if they are for the sake of heaven. And what it actually means is that they are good if it is in purpose of seeking truth rather than seeking victory. And I think as we go on with this panel, and we're talking about college campuses, a lot of the issues of free speech come down to the question: are we actually trying to seek truth, or are we trying to drive a point of view and seek victory? And I think as we go through this, that'll become clear why that's important.
Thanks, Lee. Dr. Bradley.
Thanks again for this panel. I'm really happy to be here as well. This is quite an impressive event, given the times in which we live. So thank you for hosting this. I would just say that the Christian tradition is a tradition that is founded on the pursuit of what is true. And the primary vehicle by which we pursue the truth, come let us reason together, come let us explore what is true together, involves speech. And the Christian tradition, of course, is one that seeks to speak the truth about what the Christian tradition believes about evil and Christ and salvation. And that really requires that we have the full latitude to speak freely. And that, as a primary means of communication, requires that there be an open context for that speech. And secondly, there is a direct relationship between free speech and freedom, free speech and liberty. In fact, you might think about it this way, that one of the ways in which we pursue and sustain and promote liberty is through free speech. It's the dialogue of engaging ideas, many of those that we may disagree with, for the purpose of pursuing the truth, because the truth is that which sets us free. So we want to embrace those contexts that allow that. And the entire ministry and work of the church in the world historically is absolutely predicated on that capacity and the protection of free speech.
Wonderful, thank you. Lord Kamall?
Thank you, and just call me Syed, please. I often tell people, only call me Lord Kamall if you're angry with me. I prefer to...
We'll see what you say.
Exactly. Or unless I storm off this panel because I'm offended by someone or something like that. I think it's important to recognize, I think it was Tim Carney's session today, where he said we have different identities. We don't only have one identity. We may have a religious identity of faith, but we may also have an identity of our own philosophy or our own politics. And so for me, one is I'm someone who's a believing Muslim, but I'm also someone who's a classical liberal. And so for that, I look at whether there's any inherent conflict or if they're compatible with each other. And I see no incompatibility with classical liberal thinking and with Islam. And also, if I look at the history of Islam, particularly what we call the golden age of Islam. We forget it was over 500 years ago, but people still go on about it. That was a time when Muslim scholars were incredibly open. They had translated the ancient Greek texts from the ancient Greek into Arabic, and then they were retranslated back into European and vernacular languages. And there were great debates between Muslim scholars. There was even one debate which was called Incoherence of the Philosophers, and then someone wrote another book called Incoherence of the Incoherence of the Philosophers. So those were the sort of big debates that we had in our faith. And sadly, about 500 years ago, someone declared, at that stage, or people declared, something called ijtihad, which is reasoning. Those gates were closed. And as a result, our faith and the richness of those areas where people from other faiths there were Jewish scholars, there were Christian scholars who benefited and worked together. We lost all that, sadly, and I think that was one of the most vibrant times for Islam. And so, for me, I believe is my classical liberal belief, but there's also a history of freedom in my own faith. And I personally believe you should be free to say what you think, as long as you're not encouraging violence against people or their property. Now, some people think, well, that's way too wide, and you've got to stop it before that. But I think that's one of the issues we have to debate. But what does that mean in practice when you look at specific cases? It's actually quite difficult. when you look at specific cases rather than that general philosophy. But I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. So I heard some what I would describe as teleological arguments for free speech, that free speech is the best means to pursue and attain truth. There's also arguments connecting it to a broader case for liberty, maybe grounded in human dignity, that in virtue of being human, someone has autonomy that should be respected. That includes right to speak, but also to be able to listen to different types of others' speech. And I think we could also add a historical argument that all of our faiths have at many times in history been censored. And if we apply the golden rule, that should lead us to also afford others that same freedom of speech that we desire. So we've set a foundation for our belief that free speech is important. Let's zoom in now to college campuses and discuss where you're most concerned right now about some possible violations of free speech. Lee, can I start with you again?
Yeah, so, well, let me start on, since we're talking about college campuses and about free speech, is that we have picked a very specific location, which is the college. So free speech, and people talk about, what you can say and where, can you shout in a crowded theater or whatever, but it's important to think about speech. It's important to think about that what we mean by free speech varies by the location. So what you can say or should say in a public park is very different than what you could say in a public airport. And a person that shows up on the street outside of here, if they raised a placard to say whatever they wanted to say, we might all think that was nothing. But if that person walked into this room right now and held up that placard, I think it would be a violation of effectively the culture that we're building. And so your question about what colleges, what needs to be done on free speech is a bigger question. And maybe one thing I'll say is, in addition to running Hillel, I have a business. And there's a famous business article, which is, if you have a management team, how do you make it better? And one of the things that it says is you have to create productive disagreement among the team in order to make your team better. Now, if you don't have productive disagreement, you question why. What's the reason you don't have productive disagreement? And the answer is, it's because what you lack is trust. That a team that trusts each other will have productive disagreement if they don't trust each other. And I think, so when you ask, and I was a little confused on your question, because I think if the fix on college campuses, if everyone thinks, I don't feel free to speak, the issue is not mandating more speaking. The issue that colleges are facing is that they've lacked the ability to create a culture and a community that trusts each other enough to have a debate like this. And so if I were advising a college on how to improve free speech, my first step right now would be focus on creating a culture of inquiry and truth-seeking and community and trust, and that will lead more naturally to people feeling free to speak their minds.
There is a recent report that 61% of Jewish students in the United States felt intimidated and less free to speak when there were encampments on their campus. Maybe that's an example of where one person's speech can intimidate the free speech of others.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But, the other statistic, which is similar to that, is 40% of Jewish students are afraid to admit they are Jewish at college. They will not identify themselves as Jewish. They will not show anything that's Jewish because they're afraid that if they do, they'll be attacked for views they may or may not hold.
Wow. I think one thing you highlighted that's important are time, place, and manner restrictions on free speech. Just because someone can say something doesn't mean they can say it anywhere, at any time, or in any manner. You can't put loudspeakers outside of someone's bedroom window and blare it all night, right? So, Dr. Bradley, what do you think?
So on college campuses, I'm mostly concerned about the freedom of disagreeable speech. I think one of the trends that we're seeing across the country is that college students do not know how to disagree with each other without demonizing the person with whom they disagree. And because one of the things that's happened in recent decades is that there's sort of been this merger between our speech and a person's identity and their affiliation in a tribe. And so if someone offers disagreeable speech, you're like, oh no, you're one of them. That's right. And there's been some concept creep, right? So by the way, I'm parroting Jonathan Haidt here, so don't think I'm smart. So one of the things that Haidt says in the book, The Righteous Mind, which is a book I would recommend for everyone, is that we not only demonize those with whom we disagree, we also characterize them as evil. And if the person with whom we disagree with is evil, well, evil has to be removed because it's no longer safe. And we have an entire generation of extremely coddled university students who believe that disagreeable speech is a personal attack on them and their families and their whole tribes and everyone that they associate with. And so that's how we get words like disagreeable speech as violence. And what happens? Well, if disagreeable speech is violence, we have to protect people from violence. So we have to remove the disagreeable speech. And it's not the university's fault. I mean, in the K-12 space, this extremely coddled generation, they just have not had any practice. They haven't had any experience with disagreeable speech. It's one of the reasons I recommend for parents to put their children in debate. There was a time in American history where training in rhetoric and debate was a very normal part of the education experience, where you would have to, in the context of a debate, you'd have to argue a position that you personally don't agree with for the sake of practicing and offering a experience of debating ideas. And that's something that today's college students their brains can't do it. Quick story, and then I'll end with this. When I was teaching at the King's College, one of the things that I realized I had to do to get students off their phone in class, I had to stir it up. And so one of the things that I would do is I would have these debates in class. And I would say, okay, hey, here's team A, here's team B, here's the prompt, right? Here's the argument. I need you to debate it. And I had a student say this to me once. She said, I can't really argue that position because I don't personally believe it. And I said, no, this is the point. The whole point of this exercise is to learn how to disagree and to imagine and understand the reasons why someone might arrive at conclusions that are different than yours without demonizing them. And she basically said, she physically couldn't do it. And I was just so amazed at this that she just was not able. I can't do it. I still made her do it anyway, for the record. But this is the state of the university, and as long as we are not quote unquote comfortable with disagreeable speech, because again on the college campus, if students aren't comfortable, they're not safe. And debate, as you mentioned, it's uncomfortable. And when we discourage college students from discomfort by closing off disagreeable speech, we are actually setting them, actually I would say the whole marketplace up for some disaster. So my chief concern is, how do we cultivate freedom for students on the college campus to disagree without demonizing, without mission creeping, calling it violence, and not having them believe that they're somehow unsafe in a space where there is disagreeable speech, which is one of the reasons why so many students find themselves muted They find themselves unfree to speak up in class because they are afraid of the consequences. And part of the consequences being excised from the community. I said my last point, I got one little more. This is a footnote, you can look this up later. What's happening on college campuses right now is that, and I've seen this for years, is that if a student says something in class that's disagreeable, the other students outside of class will attack that student and create memes about that student on social media. And then that will sort of go, there's some virality there, and then the other students will think, oh yeah, he's one of them, or she's one of them, and that actually will discourage the student from speaking in the future.
Wow. Free speech protections exist only to protect disagreeable speech. If everything was agreeable, you wouldn't need laws about it.
And it'd be boring.
I agree. Syed.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Anthony just said there. I think what's really important, particularly at college where you're there to learn, learning is not just about reading textbooks and just passing the exams. I mean that is what a lot of higher education has become. Actually, it's become that certification. Hasn't been, if you think about the grade inflation, there are jobs when I was a child that you could get leaving school at 16 or 18. Now you need a college degree. Now you may even need a master's. And so what a lot of university has become about certification to show that you've got that certificate rather than knowledge and exploring knowledge. And I too also find it very difficult or challenging to get my students. I often say to them at my very first lecture of the module, my ground rules are feel free to disagree, but also be polite. And if you feel offended, let others know, and let's see how we can talk about that. And I also challenge the students, particularly when it's obvious they have one view. So I'll give you a quick example. There are some students who think, how could Americans vote for Trump? Okay, I said, well, okay, stop there. He won the election. Whatever you think of him or whatever you think of his policies, think about why someone in a town that's lost industry years ago, the Rust Belt or whatever, might feel more attracted to the message that President Trump was putting out rather than his opponent, for example. Think about it. Put yourself in their shoes. And I don't think there's enough of that about thinking about the other. It's demonizing the other rather than thinking about the other. Why does that person have that perspective? And I often say to them, I want you to challenge me. I say to them, Phil, if you can challenge me, because what do academics do? We look at the way the world works in practice, and we try and explain it in theory. You may not, and think also about which theory you agree with. So I teach international relations sometimes. Are you a realist? Are you a liberal institutionalist? Are you a Marxist? But even if you're one of them, think about how a Marxist would look at this, or how a constructivist would look at this particular problem in the world. And I think that's our responsibility. Now, I'm very fortunate. I teach at 2 universities, and one of them is a Catholic university. So people feel very comfortable there, especially if you are of faith. And for many years, Muslims and Jews and others have gone to Catholic schools because they felt comfortable going to those schools. They could express their faith there. And it was interesting. There was a debate on one of our interfaith forums, and the person who was the administrator said, "I want to put up a big pride flag, and I want all the interfaith community to sort of write supportive messages." And one of the academics said, "Can I just say I'm really sorry, but this is a personal thing, and I feel uncomfortable doing that." Now, they could do that at St. Mary's, but they probably would not be able to do that at a lot of other universities. And whether or not I agree with that person or not, they had the freedom to do that at that university. And I think that's really important that people feel free to do that, but also understand. I think we also have to be very careful because, maybe I'll come on to that later. I think with freedom comes responsibility, but when does responsibility become self-censorship? But I'll wait until a further discussion for that.
One of the themes that emerged with that question was that being challenged, experiencing debate, learning different sides of a question is necessary for mature human development, and also cultivates virtues, patience, humility, self-restraint. So we could add that to the list of moral arguments for free speech. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll go to some audience questions. But the legal right to free speech covers some speech we might consider harmful or even immoral. We have to go beyond merely allowing free speech, but also actively work to promote positive forms of speech, respectful forms of speech. how can we actively encourage people to use their freedom of speech with moral principle and to engage in civil dialogue, especially on college campuses? Lee?
Well, first, our organization, Hillel, which is this large multi-campus organization on 800 campuses around the world, we have a civil dialogue center. Effectively, we try to create these kinds of forums at our Hillels. And I will tell you that it has been unbelievably difficult to get students to engage in civil dialogue. And it's a lot of what you just said. People feel so certain about their points of view that the idea of coming together to talk is viewed as an insult, a violation. So we're still at it. And I think that gets back to what I said before, which is, so Jewish students felt completely ostracized over the last year and a half, really. And it was from morning till night, right? They would leave their dorm rooms and they'd hear the chanting. They'd walk through the campus. They couldn't get into the library. They'd go into a class that had nothing to do with anything around the Israel issue. And they were confronted by a professor who wanted to tell them they were wrong. They'd go back to their phones and they'd see it on their phones. They'd go to their dorms and there'd be a swastika on their door. This was just going on and on. And so this notion of speech, which is a huge value, and as I started by saying, is a high value of Jews and me personally. But at a university where the goal of the university is learning, this is where it needs to start. In other words, I would say the first thing to go after is not speech. The first thing to go after is trust and civil discourse. And there were some universities that did that. Like they actually started on October 8th, and they had people coming together talking about the issues. That's where it worked best. So again, I think the thing to work on here is trust and community, and the speech will come. Fantastic. Anthony?
Yeah, I would say that if we really want to make some progress on this, we have to create a space where students are comfortable to disagree and not internalize that as a personal attack. They also need to want to learn. And as you said, for many students and their families, the university isn't about learning, it's about credentialing. And so they don't arrive on campus wanting to learn. I mean, there was a time in American history where professors took on this sort of disposition that I'm going to come and I'm going to interrogate all the things that your parents taught you, and I'm going to sort of dismantle them and expose them, and then I'm going to switch it, and then I'm going to send you off so that you can think clearly and differently about these things like I do in class. Well, now it's different. Now it's, you're in my class, and now I'm going to rubber stamp and validate all of your emotions and everything that you believe. I just want to tell you that you're right. Now, what's also true in the university, and this is a very long conversation, is that professors' course evaluations matter a lot, especially if you're tenure track. And if students complain that you speak offensively in class, you actually could lose your job. This is a fact. At NYU, in the bathrooms at NYU today, there are free speech reporting devices. And so if students are in class at NYU and a professor says something that they consider to be offensive, they actually can report the professor from the bathroom to the administration. That doesn't really foster a context for trust. When as a professor, you know that if I say something that might be offensive, they're going to run to the administration. Why is that? Because coddled students have always had adults come in and referee their disagreements. They've always had that from 3 years old. And so they've never had to work things out on their own. That's because they're coddled. I would personally like us to engage the discipline or the culture of hospitality. I fundamentally believe that if we had sort of disagreeable speech over food, over fellowship, over connection, over community, to me at least, it would be a very different experience. I've never in my life seen someone remain upset or remain agitated while they're eating chocolate or ice cream. And so what would it look like for us to have context universities where people weren't just coming to debate ideas, to argue, they were coming to sit together and commune together and eat together. And in the context of this experience of hospitality, what happens is you humanize the other person and you have to listen because you're chewing, right? You're not just waiting on the next thought to speak because you're eating a piece of bread. And so there's a rhythm to having disagreements over food. And it's not like it makes the disagreements that we have sanitized, but it provides a space which people can actually engage those while humanizing the other, recognizing that maybe, perhaps, there's a reason that the person has arrived at this conclusion, and I want to understand why you believe what you believe. And we need to, I would argue, to use hospitality as a way to create a context like that.
Wonderful. Maybe serve a jar of peanut butter or really dry bread, something that takes a long time to
Yes,
chew.
and if they're over 21, grad students, cocktails would be great. You know, some Manhattans or something like that, maybe a Negroni or two, not too many, maybe a margarita, put a pitcher of margaritas on the table and say, let's talk together.
Awesome. Syed?
You just mentioned alcohol. I'm now offended.
Free speech.
I'm going to walk away now. I think this is very difficult. I wish we could say we've got a simple answer here. I wish we could say you would have civic discourse classes, but then you'd have to make them compulsory, and then you're coercing students. And we believe in freedom, and we believe in the right for students not to want to go to those classes unless, so you've got that dimension. The other dimension, I think, particularly going back to campuses, is you've got to remember there are a couple of principles here at play which may not always work in the same direction, particularly if you're a classically liberal. So, for example, there's also the property rights. If you have a right to exercise who you allow onto your campus. If it's a private university, obviously it depends on whether it's a state university and it's taxpayers' money. But we've sometimes got to balance, freedom of speech with property rights. And if you think you own that property, or you're very high up, you're a chancellor or vice chancellor, you might say, actually, I do believe in free speech, but I know if this person comes and speaks, all hell will break loose on my campus. It could get very unpleasant. It costs us a lot of money. So we have to think about that balance between property rights and freedom of speech. But I think it's, we've pre-selected in some ways because we've come together of different faiths, and we want to talk about this in a civil way. But I think one of the things that we all have to recognise about free speech is that with it comes responsibility. And you may be feeling very angry about something at the moment. I mean, there are lots of people, let's talk about, what's happening in Israel and Palestine at the moment. There are lots of people on different sides feeling very angry, feeling very emotional about it. And probably, but in a forum like this, you've got to think about how do you speak in a civilized way or a civic way to say, well, this is the way I'm feeling about this particular issue. Not you're all a bunch of murderers and you just want to kill us or you want to wipe us from the map. And both sides could accuse each other of that. No, just say, actually, this is the way I see it. It's very difficult, especially when people get very emotive about these issues. But I think even though it's difficult, doesn't mean we shouldn't try it. So, for example, in the Parliament, we have all-party parliamentary groups. That means people from different political parties come together. We have a whole list of them. And I've been talking to a couple of my Jewish colleagues and saying, should we be thinking about, instead of an all-party parliamentary group for Palestine, an all-party parliamentary group for Israel, and that's fine, they're entitled to that, should we think about forming an all-party parliamentary group for Israeli-Palestinian peace? Should we think about, for example, inviting, because actually my Jewish colleague is a chair of an organisation that works with Palestinians and Jews in Israel and Palestine together to work together. Should we think about having a forum like that where we invite those organisations to come and tell us about their wonderful work? That would be a very positive thing. But when we thought about it, and we tried to recruit other politicians, they said it's too early. People are still raw. So while we might have some wonderful ideas on this stage that we should have civic discourse, this is going to take time and this is going to be very difficult, particularly what's going on in the world at the moment and particularly what's going on in the Middle East. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I think we actually have to try. Now, the other issue about responsibility is sometimes you can be accused of self-censorship. So, for example, Salman Rushdie, when he wrote the Satanic Verses, he knew that that would offend some Muslims, but he also had a right to offend Muslims, because that's free speech. Should he have self-censored? When Charlie Hebdo published those Danish cartoons, they knew some people would be offended, but they also had a right to offend people in a free society. Should they have exercised self-censorship, even though they knew whether or not they knew the consequences? And that's very difficult. We will all have different opinions about that, and so there's no one principle or one application of free speech that we can all agree on. We might, in theory, believe in free speech until we're offended, but what does that mean in practice? And each case is very different and involves very different individuals with real emotions running high. But I just do think, what Lee said, it's difficult. We have to try. That's all I can say.
Can I just follow up on this? First, I appreciate you saying that, and you're highlighting, and we've almost avoided some of the hard issues, and we're not going to get into all of them, but just to flag some of the hard issues. One, when we say free speech, everyone has a different thing in their mind. Speech has almost become code for anti-authoritarian. So everything is viewed as speech. When we say free speech on college campuses, mostly, not all, but mostly what people are thinking about is effectively a mass protest that violates a school policy. And should that be able to happen? That's sort of what we mean by free speech. And we could talk about what that means. The second thing people talk about is the actual content, right? This is the hard part, right? So it is important to remember that, and we talked about this at lunch, right, before, that the greatest ideas in society came because people could speak freely and come up with new things. Some of the worst things that's happened to society have also become because bad ideas took hold. And I do think there is something to the idea that everything that happened on college campuses last year has and is leading to violence in the real world, outside of college campuses. We've had incidents in the US just in the last 2 months of a break-in at the governor of Pennsylvania's house with people shouting the same things that were shouted on college campuses. We've had a Jewish protest firebombed, and we've had an assassination at an Israeli event in Washington, D.C.
And actually, ironically, they were peace activists, weren't they?
They were killed, peace activists killed. Yeah. So this is to say, and I think you started with this is complicated, and I think the whole notion, and it's sort of a genius about, you throw away, it's just time, place, and manner, but time, place, and manner really matter, because if we could find a forum for people to actually have a discussion, that's very different than I'm going to block the library and sleep there all night and prevent you from getting in and, have a sign that says, a Zionist is not allowed, or like, we don't want Jews here, or something like that. Very different.
Yeah, just one last point here. The University of Chicago has a statement on free speech. And if I was a parent, I would say, if you're looking at a college, just ask them if they've adopted that statement or not. Because in that statement, and this is something we adopted in tweaks at the King's College in New York, is that on matriculation, during the application process, as students are onboarded to the university, they're essentially warned or informed that you are going to engage thoughts and ideas that you find disagreeable. You're going to be offended by some things. You're absolutely going to have some ideas that you thought were right are actually going to be told that you're wrong, that we're going to have a context at this university, University XYZ, where we disagree on purpose. In fact, we can't learn without that. And so what Chicago did is they have created a culture where students know on arrival that they're going to experience disagreeable speech. So it's not a surprise. And I wonder if more universities need to set the standard during the application process, during the intake process, to inform students that you're going to disagree in class, you're going to have professors with whom you disagree, and it's okay. It's actually okay that we disagree, because this is how we learn together in this community so we can arrive and pursue the truth together. And that requires a process of debate, and that this university is going to be a place where that happens, to say that right up front. And I wonder if more universities, at least here in the States, need to do a better job of preparing students and their parents for the fact that the university is actually a context for learning.
Can I just quickly add, we have a university like that in the UK, the University of Buckingham, which is also where I teach, and the Vice-Chancellor, very pro-speech. He's taken on professors from elsewhere who've felt isolated or left their previous universities because they were criticised for what they said. But the administration of the university tried to take him out because he had an anti-woke agenda, for example. So it just shows, it's that long march through the institutions. It's incredibly difficult.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. We have time for a few audience questions. As a reminder, if you'd like to submit one, please use the QR code. Our top rated question is, how helpful or unhelpful is the approach used in the speech debates by Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro to advancing actual free speech on campuses? So my understanding of those two individuals mentioned is they'll set up a table on a college campus and invite students to line up, and then they'll engage in debate on some of the most controversial political questions at the time. Thoughts on that?
I'm a big believer in this concept of tabling. I actually attended a table once at MIT. It was set up outside of the encampment, and it was super interesting because inside the encampment, nobody engaged with anybody outside the encampment. They were entirely in their own world. And there was a table set up right outside. In this case, it was by a former Israeli soldier who was a grad student there. And I stood there for hours, and all day long, people were coming by, asking him questions, and he was challenged, and he challenged them, and it was a very healthy debate. And I thought that was as a way to think about how to create free speech and also get a marketplace of ideas, I thought it was very effective.
Great.
So what I actually saw this week, which I thought was much better for Charlie Kirk, is that, so he normally is on campus. It's him and a mic and his security people. You can see him standing there, and a bunch of undergraduate students. And they typically ask questions that, at least for him, are pretty predictive, and he has their sort of pet answers. But the best conversation I saw was with Charlie Kirk and a professor. And what I would love to see more of, actually, is students sort of watching, experiencing what happens when peers disagree. And I would love to see more debates with Charlie Kirk or whomever with faculty members at these universities, and let students engage and participate in that. Because there's something lost, I think, when young people never get to witness people with whom they respect, civilly agree and disagree. One of the things that we would do at the King's College is we would have panels of professors who disagreed on things openly, and just let students watch us disagree and still walk away and be friendly and laugh together and things like that. So I think what I've often seen, because there's some campuses here in the area where you see this, is that you often get these figures, they come in, they're kind of preaching to the choir. It's adversarial, it's sometimes hostile, it's highly charged emotion. I'm not sure what's accomplished. Both sides walk away even more committed to their ideas. But I think there's something different if they're in a room with people who know just as much as they do and can poke holes in some of their arguments and let students watch and participate in some of that.
Yeah, I don't think there's one answer, and I don't think one answer is necessarily better than the other. I think we have to try lots of different ways. We have to, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's be diverse. We can all try what we can do. So, I try, for example, when I have students from different parts of the world, I will ask them for the following week to start the lecture with a presentation, but I would make sure that I pair students who are not sitting with each other, but are actually and may come from different continents, and get the two of them to work together to present to make the presentation the following week. I try and get my students. Someone will make a point rather than me answering, or they ask me a question. I will say, "Is there anyone who either disagrees with what he or she said, or actually understands what someone who disagrees with this would say? What do you think is the counter-argument?" And I think we need to encourage that as much as we can as educators. But let's not forget there are lots of things happening. People, even lecturers are human too, and sometimes they just want an easy life. Sometimes they think, okay, if the kids are here just to get a certificate, all I'll do my market, I'll do my lecture, I'll give them the slides, I'll mark. I don't have to do much more than that. But actually, I love teaching, and I love to see my students debate with each other. But some lecturers, maybe their priority is actually their research and writing papers that are published in obscure academic journals that no one reads, but they'll get high academic points for that. So, it's very easy for us to sit on this stage and say, this is the solution. I just think we have to find lots of different solutions, but remember what the goal is just to get our students, our young people, and even older people to engage in discourse. One of the other things I think is really important is intergenerational conversations. There aren't enough of those intergenerational conversations. There are stereotypes being made about young people, about the boomers who had it so good, and look what they've left us. We've got nothing. We can't afford a property. And then the older people saying, why do these kids why do they feel entitled? So this happens at all levels. And I think we've got to think about how we can have those discussions and those conversations, not only on campuses, but actually outside campuses as well.
Wonderful. We have over 30 questions in the app right now.
Great.
One word answers to all, yeah.
The highest, I don't think you want all 30, but the highest rated one is, how do we civilly engage in disagreement with protesters?
Ooh, that is a really difficult one. And you've seen the videos where protesters are confronted. I'm not sure whether the discussion has to be at the protest. I remember a quick example. There was an organisation called the English Defence League, and they were protesting outside a mosque. And the way that the mosque handled it, I thought, was really good. The guys came out and they said, "Why didn't you come in for a cup of tea?" What could be more British than having a cup of tea? But it wasn't there at the scene of the protest. They brought them into a room. And I'm not sure you can have that civil discourse at that protest when people are feeling emotional and they're all in a group and the group dynamics are feeling really good because they're chanting the same slogan. But actually, if you can find a way to take them out, not literally take them out, sorry, not a sort of Dirty Harry sort of way, but actually take them away from that context and take them into a calmer place. Or say, well, let's have a chat. Now, some people will refuse that once again, but I think that's one way of doing it.
I mean, there's a lot of social psychology there, sort of groupthink and tribalism. When you asked the question, my first thought was wait until the process is over. Mm-hmm. And like I said, sort of pull people aside and engage in a conversation. But, one of the things that I just sort of do as a tactic is just ask questions. Just ask a lot of questions. Like, why do you believe this? How did you come to that conclusion? What about this? What about that? As opposed to saying, no, that's wrong. That's, you're kind of, that's dumb. That's a horrible idea. But just sort of engage the other person as a person because they're humans. Sort of treat them with love, respect, dignity, right? Sort of look in their eyes, right? Laugh, treat them as someone with whom they're worthy of love and affection, connection, and have a discussion in that context. I would just wait until the protest is over, let them work that all out, and then have the conversation.
Good.
So maybe this is a little darker, but our experience was there was nothing rational that could be said. We could not engage with people in the protests. And there was an exclusionary thing to it, which is that, again, if you were viewed as a Zionist or a Jew or something like that didn't agree with them, that you were outside of their group and not worthy of conversation. So we just had very little success. But I do think your point about outside is key, because when these protests are limited in time, so yes, you can have a protest, It's going to be on the quad. It's going to be from 12 to 1, and it's going to end. And then those people go off, and then maybe you have an opportunity. If the protest is going to go on for a day, a week, a month, people are going to sleep in tents. They're never going to contact another point of view. There was nothing that could be done.
Next question. What is the proper role of the government in regulating campus conduct?
That's a tough one. Once again, I'd say it depends on who owns the university and ownership structures. You know, I'm not familiar with the US, and in the UK, most of our universities are state. Actually, not all of them are. So there's that tension between property rights and freedom of speech. But I think actually uphold the law. You know, is make sure the law is upheld. And once again, that's very difficult because often you're relying on the discretion of the police officer, for example, or the others. And someone who disagrees with what's happening may think that the police aren't doing their job, even if they're doing it to the letter of the law. But it's tough. I'll give a quick example. There was a video of a Jewish student who said he was asked by a policeman, "Are you Jewish?" And that went up and it went viral. And then they played the wider video, and you saw the police officer saying to the Jewish student, "You do realize there's a protest here. If you're going to walk through that, you know that's going to be very difficult. You know, you do have a right to walk where you want, but you're going to walk right through this protest. Do you want to do that?" And then that was the wider context. Now, he was effectively saying, please don't stir things up. But when you had the snippet of that video, it looked like the policeman was saying, "You're Jewish, why are you going there?" Now, we will disagree about that. There will be people in the audience who say, well, actually, the policeman was wrong and he should have made sure that that Jewish student felt free to walk through that protest. And there'll be others who say, well, he knew what would happen and he was trying to protect the student and make sure there wasn't any more conflict. Once again, that just shows there's no simple answer. We'd probably disagree on what that answer is.
I would disagree on what that answer is, but yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So I know what's behind the question, right? The question is, right, we see what's going on with the government and putting pressure on universities. I'll just say that there is a legal rule in the US that applies to campuses, which is that college campuses have to ensure that every student has an access to education. So that if a university has created or fostered a culture that prevents a minority, in this case Jews, but it could apply to any minority, blacks or Hispanics or anything, any minority from getting an education because they feel intimidated to go anywhere, that university is violating the law. And that is a role for government to deal with. Now, the way they deal with it, we could have a whole debate on what the right way to do it is, but there is a role to play.
And that's a tough line to walk between not intimidating, allowing intimidation, while at the same time not banning anything that's offensive.
It's a thin line between offensive and, sorry to cut across you, hope you're not offended. It's a very thin line between being offended and, so what was the word you used, feeling intimidated. You know, we will all respond differently. You know, people who saw, for example, the Muhammad cartoons, they would all respond very differently. So I think it's a very difficult line. I mean, and people have to find an answer to that.
Yeah, really quickly. So at least in my mind, the government has a role to play in protecting free speech, the freedom to speak and the freedom to disagree. But I also think that perhaps the government should get out of the way and let the universities decide on how they want to manage that, right? Because it's their community, they know their students, they know the issues, and so let the universities, like the University of Chicago, for example, did, let them take the lead, because you're the experts in education, not a bunch of politicians, let them lead on how to actually adjudicate and manage how speech will happen in their community. Because some colleges here in the US have 200 students, some have 80,000. And so the way that you engage those issues with those various populations is going to be very, very different. So I always advocate for sort of removing the government from attempting to do things in places where they have no expertise or context, but to also give the universities that freedom while the state is there to protect the overarching freedom to disagree.
Awesome. One of the words we hear at Acton University all week is subsidiarity. Maybe that applies to what you said. So we have time just for one more question, so I'll ask this, and if there's other closing thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with, please feel free to also mention those. Why do some professors use their positions at some colleges as hindrances for students using their free speech? And I'll maybe add to that, what can professors actively do to encourage positive exercising of the students' free speech and civil dialogue?
I think you're asking the wrong guys, because I suspect we are all people who would want our students to have free discourse. I remember once I was teaching my students, and I was on an MBA course years ago, and I was leaving because I was going to politics, and I had a drink with my students. I had a non-alcoholic drink, by the way. And we were chatting away, and one of them said, "You were always really balanced. You were always really fair." And I thought, well, what's wrong with that? He said, well, actually, there's quite a lot of left-wing professors who only give us one perspective here. So I think we're the wrong people, because I think we probably do want to give our students that balance. It's those who don't want to give their students that balance and actually want to push one perspective, and that's really difficult. But I'm not sure what we can do about it.
I always want to put my students in a position where they actually don't know what I think. And for some students over the years, that's been really frustrating. They're like, we want to know what you believe. I'm like, no, this isn't the point. The point of us is to reason together. Because they're used to being told how to think and what to think. And so they just want someone to tell them what the answer is. And I mean, this might sound a bit cheeky here, but I think a lot of professors are just narcissists. And so if you're a professor and you're a narcissist, you don't want anybody to disagree because you're the authority. And they don't have the epistemic humility to be open to the possibility that they might be wrong. And I think students are also, many aren't open to the possibility that they might be wrong because there is too much internal, emotional, psychological identity capital that's invested in the idea. But if you're open to the possibility that you might be wrong, or like you said, if you're open to the possibility that your students may teach you something, right? I mean, for me, the classroom is an environment where we're learning together. I might be the expert on X or Y, but how we think about that in terms of some of the strengths and weaknesses, I mean, I plagiarize, and I'm just being honest, I plagiarize my students' comments all the time. I'll say, but here's the thing, I tell them that's a great idea. That's a brilliant idea. I'm going to take your idea and write an article about it. I'm going to make money off of it. But I just tell them up front, thank you for saying something that I hadn't thought about. So if we're creating the sort of environments where professors are not narcissists and sort of, if they're open to being to being humble in the class, you invite students, I think, to disagree and to do that civilly because we're in this thing together. And I would tell them, I'm just a little bit ahead of you. I don't know everything. I do know a few things, but I don't know everything. But I want us to keep learning together and to be curious together. You can't exercise curiosity without free speech. You can't learn without curiosity. And curiosity is messy, right? There's bumps, you fall, you skin your knee, you bust your head open. Things happen in the context of curiosity. So I would love for more universities to encourage the kind of curiosity that invites epistemic humility and to be open to the possibility that I might be wrong as a professor and you might be wrong as a student. But as long as the universities hire narcissists, and I say this because narcissism can get you tenure really quickly. Like really quickly. And being a narcissist can also come across as authoritative, and it comes with this sort of air of expertise. And so maybe the universities need to be open to inviting people with the sort of humility that they might be wrong, and that might create a different environment.
Excellent. Lee?
I know we have 1 minute, and this, I can't beat that. And, this gets into the questions of, what does a university professor, what are they teaching, right? So if they're teaching a course on child psychology, are they really experts on what's going on in the Middle East, and should they really be teaching about that? But just to end, so without getting into the details of it, I'll just say, I think kind of where I started, which I think the answer to this is back to this concept of for the sake of heaven, which is, are you teaching for the sake of and arguing and trying to have this discussion with your students for the sake of truth or for the sake of victory? And so if you're doing it for the sake of victory, which is I am a professor, I have a point of view on a topic that I don't have an expertise in, but you should agree with my point of view, and if you don't, you're going to get a bad grade, that we wouldn't want to accept. But if you're doing it in really pursuit of truth, then that is what the university is all about.
Brilliant. Lee, Anthony, Syed, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.